Hello and welcome back to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Avdiivka, where there has been further developments of the situation. Following the updates from yesterday, we saw that the Ukrainians launched a counterattack. This was a counterattack that was launched with their elite units, that is their active defense unit. And in that counterattack, they tried to recapture the positions of Avdiivka and make sure that the Russians do not get a foothold here on the hill west of Avdiivka, as well as the first line, which most likely has some sort of fortification and trench next to it, which is why the Russian advance first stopped within Avdiivka. But following the reports of the counterattack by the Ukrainians, the Russians launched their own attack and strengthened their offensive forces and managed to capture this nonetheless. This shows that the Russians had planned for the Ukrainian counterattack and have managed to win against that counterattack so far. As I show by this icon right here, the Ukrainian counterattack is still present. This means that the Ukrainian counterattack is still ongoing, as there's a lot of positional fighting taking place. With the additional Ukrainian reinforcements, the Ukrainians will have a much stronger fighting chance to hold back the Russian advance than before they arrived. But this is still not enough, as the Russians simply have put enough troops into this. I'm missing footage on this operation, so it's very difficult to see exactly how the fighting is taking place. But what we know for sure is that with this, the Russians have prepared a tactic for when the Ukrainians arrive with the counterattack. They were prepared for it, they anticipated it, and this is why we're seeing more Russian success than we've seen in previous attempts. So this likely shows that the Russian army is adapting to the situation and is preparing according to what happens, or maybe they are just watching my videos and learned very quickly from what I said. Regardless of that, with this we see that there is clearly a focus of the Russian army, and that is to secure the area by Avdiivka, to secure the northern flank of future operations in the direction of Peshane and Berestove. Talking about Berestove, it is reported that there are further Russian offensive operations in the direction of the village, so it is likely that the Russians will look to take control of it as well. With an attack on Berestove, it will likely take place here to the north, which bypasses the forest lines that are to the northwest and to the northeast of the village. So with this, we see that the Russians are trying to take advantage of the weakest point towards Berestove and use that to launch an attack on the village to try to capture it. If the Russians manage to capture Berestove, then they can finally fully secure Novoselivsk. By taking control over the forest lines as well, they'll have a secure flank to the south for further operations westward, which would go to Peshane. So likely the current state of affairs with this section of the front line, the Russians will look to attack in the direction of Berestove as they secure the northern flank at the same time, before launching a mounted assault from both the south and the north in the direction of Peshane to try and attack it from two sides, pincer it, and launch attacks towards it. This will likely continue in a westward direction towards the Oskar River line, depending on what their ambitions for this operation is. But it is clear that in the northern direction, their next step needs to be to capture this first line here to the west of Orlivka to secure the northern flank, as well as capture the rest of this first line, which is currently in the gray zone. And they also need to secure the northern flank as a whole to prevent further Ukrainian counterattacks, because that is currently ongoing and an ongoing threat to the Russian advance. Therefore, to simplify it, we will see further Russian aggressive directions in the north, also likely in the south to expand the zone of control, so it isn't just a foothold in the hills, but proper control of it. So they'll likely look to gain control over these forest patches here, these forest lines here to the west, and this forest patch here to the southwest of Avdiivka and to the north of Peshane. We'll also see offensive operations in the direction of Berestove, maybe even a combined attack from Novoselivsk direction, which will face multiple fortifications and forest lines, as well as from the north in the direction of Berestove itself, to flank these fortifications and bypass them, after which they'll launch attacks in the northern direction going through the forest lines to reach Peshane from the south, as well as from the northeast and in the northern direction after capturing the forest patch. So we're seeing that there's likely going to be a multiple part offensive operation, but all of this requires additional troops, further reinforcements, and a lot of firepower, as well as the ability to keep dealing with Ukrainian reinforcements and counterattacks of their more elite units. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Orlivka that there has been a Ukrainian offensive operation in the direction of the city, and this has taken place in a gray zone area between the two front lines, where the Russians actually had control over these fortifications ever since the ceasefire in early 2015. And with this, we see that the Ukrainians have yet again launched an attack in the direction of Orlivka after the previous attempts at the heights here to the northwest of the city. So with this, we see that there is continuous operations or probing attacks where the Ukrainians will try and get better positioning here to the west of Orlivka to possibly stage a larger attack in the future. We see that there are multiple layers of fortifications and trenches and defensive systems here in the western direction, but this is not at the level of the Surovikin line. This would be more reasonable to fight here compared to that area, especially with the large fields filled with mines in the south. This would not have the same. Instead, this would be urban fighting, which the Ukrainians have had a lot of experience with, but so have the Russians. So how it will go is up to anyone's guess. But what we do know is that with this, we see that there is an interest by the Ukrainians to launch further operations within Russian territory in Ukraine. And this advance is actually significant because the largest minefields and the most dangerous parts of this front line prior to the entering of the urban areas is these fortifications in the front. So with this, we see that there's likely either the Russians weren't prepared for this and were simply caught off guard, or the Ukrainians simply launched a very strong push, which allowed them to push the Russians back and take control over this fortification. But with this, we see that there is going to be further ground for further offensive operations by the Ukrainians, and they'll likely continue pushing both in the southern direction towards the forest patch and in the eastern direction towards the next line of defenses, which will likely have expanded at this point, likely to here to the south, rather than just a straight line to the western direction. So there is this here in the Orlivka direction. We then move further south to the Avdiivka direction, where we have seen this small advance here to the east of Opitne, and with this we're going to likely see further advances by the Russians to secure the military base here to the southwest of Avdiivka after their control of it, which pretty much went without a fight. The Ukrainians are now trying to recapture it by launching counterattacks. So the Russians need to stabilize the front by first capturing the first line here to the west of the military base, connecting Opitne with the military base and securing the western flank, after which they'll need to launch operations in the northern direction towards this Dacha area, where they'll have to attack from multiple directions to secure it for the security of the western flank of the Russian footholds to the southwest of Avdiivka, and to launch further operations in the direction of the citadel area. So there's a lot of work for the Russians here to the southwest of Avdiivka before they can move further, otherwise their positions would be in grave danger to Ukrainian counterattacks, which are happening all the time, both in the residential area in the Serkohodza direction, here to the military base in the central area here to the south of Avdiivka, where there are multiple fortifications in the Dacha area, the forest patches aligned with that, as well as fighting here by the forest patches to the east of Avdiivka. This is rather Russian offensives in this operation, as we see that they have managed to capture some fortifications here in the southern outskirts of it, and we'll likely see more operations by the Russians fighting through that. So we're seeing a lot of fighting to the south of Avdiivka. The northern parts also have a lot of fighting, but this is less intense and less numerous. As for the northern flanks and southern flanks, they are largely stable with a lot of back and forth, but there's no operational offensive or technical advantage of either side right now until there are further reinforcements arriving to either side. Now for a quick topic before we end off the video, there has been a lot of talk about Zaluzhny and him being fired or not fired, back and forth. There is a lot of talk from the leaking channels of the office of the president in Ukraine that talked about the Zelensky administration wanted to fire Zaluzhny and replace him with Budanov so that they can have more control over the military, because Zaluzhny is too popular by himself. Meanwhile, Zaluzhny refused and didn't want to retire, didn't want to give up his position as commander-in-chief, and at the same time he is, according to these leaks, focusing on waiting and surviving until the 31st of March, after which Zelensky's term ends, and he will stay in power regardless of what Zelensky wants or not. While Zelensky is too worried about firing him because Zelensky is way more popular than Zelensky is, and that could very easily backfire if he wanted to fire him. But rather than all of that, of whether or not he wants to fire him or not, the main point is if Zelensky decides to fire Zelensky and replace him with Budanov, then the Ukrainian army would not perform as well as it does today. The main reason for that is Budanov is not a military man. Zelensky is the only man currently that I know of in the Zelensky administration that is capable of controlling such a massive army that Ukraine has. Budanov is a spy guy. He is like Putin. Putin wouldn't be able to control the military. He would never have the necessary skills and qualities to do so. Neither does Budanov. Instead, Budanov, what he is good at and what he's been doing so far is the attacks within Russian territory, whether it be the drone attacks or the attack on the bridge of the Kerch Bridge and so on. All of these operations that happens with spies and generally all the attacks that Ukraine refuses to take responsibility for, all of these are simply Budanov's specialty. It is he who organizes and does all of these things, whether it is a Russian guy that they want to get rid of or whatever else that they operate. He's the one who plans all of these and executes them. But he's also Zelensky's right-hand man, so it's simply putting power where he can control it. Zelensky simply sees Zelensky as someone who he can't control and therefore wants to replace him. That is the purpose of the whole thing. But that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.